How do we make sense of what it is that we're called to do with our stuff, with our money, with our possessions? What Satan is seeking to do is to subtly, slowly pull us away from the life that we are called to live over time. We're stuck trying to do the things that our society expects us to do. And somewhere along the way, kind of sprinkle a little bit of Jesus on top of it. This all stems from what you believe about God. If Satan is at work widening that gap, then our role, our job is to bridge that gap.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Purpose-Filled Money Podcast. We're your hosts, Courtney and Caleb Sams. And today we're going to continue our conversation about what we consider one of the greatest money and possession managers of all time as we lay the groundwork for our conversation about budgeting, which is the first of our essentials.
Yeah, we've moved on from our fundamental conversation, and we entered into a conversation about, okay, if we're going to figure out what these essential things are, what are the building blocks when we think about what to do with our money? Where do we start?
Yes.
And we're going into budgeting and wanted to really navigate, okay, but what we're trying to do in this conversation is understand better what does Scripture say about this thing. And we kind of made the argument in the last two episodes that it's not really a lack of understanding of how to budget. It's not a lack of ability to budget. In our own personal lives and the lives of the people we work with and our clients and people that we talk to, it's not that they don't know how to budget. Of course, there's always times around the edges where we can help provide context or, strategies, but it's not about they can't do it.
Yeah, the general ability oftentimes is there.
Yeah.
It's just we as humans go through seasons where we're really on top and good, and then there's other seasons where we might not be, but the core of that tends to be we have some innate belief about God and about what we're supposed to do with our finances, that if that's off center, it tends to ripple out into like we're just not really good stewards with the rest of it. So
this is probably a good time to say, if you haven't listened to the last two episodes, which was really one episode that we decided went too long. So if you feel that weird cutoff in the middle of the first part one, it's because we weren't intending it to be two parts. As we walked through the early years of Joseph's life. And I think the thing about Joseph is he's a beautiful story because we're going to kind of skip around in this episode in his life. And our assumption here is that this isn't the first time you've talked about Joseph. Joseph's one of the classic VBS characters, one of the big Sunday school guys. And so we all most likely have interacted with Joseph's story. If that's not the case, feel free to read through. Pretty much the last third of Genesis is centered around Joseph. But also don't hesitate to reach out to us or somebody you trust to talk more about Joseph. But we're going to operate from that assumption a little bit today. And what we think you would see in the last two episodes is most likely something that isn't foreign to you and your personal experience. We've said multiple times on this podcast, if you're here, if this is interesting to you, if this conversation around bridging the gap between faith and finances is resonating with you, it's probably because you, like us, experience this cyclical nature with your money. That there are moments where you're doing really good and things are lining up and you've got purpose behind your decisions. And then you start to drift off mission. And I think what you'd see in the first half of Joseph's story is an incredibly similar experience, that Joseph is going through this downward cycle. Every step he takes, at one point he's the person set to inherit Israel from his father and be the Behor, and then he finds himself sold into slavery, and then he finds himself in the ruler's and the captain of the guard's house, and and finds himself leading that, and then cycles down again, and he finds himself in prison, and then he's the leader of the prison. But I mean, how high up is that? Right?
Yeah. And while we don't think that your specific experience might be that you just have a continual downward trajectory and end up in prison,
we hope not.
We hope not. The biggest theme is you've likely seen yourself in seasons where you feel really, really good. You feel really, really in control.
Yeah.
And what we're going to see is that when you feel like you are in control, that's likely not going to work out in your favor, and it's likely not going to be something that forwards the kingdom's mission.
Well, we talked about, like, one of the things we want to learn how to do is identify those cracks, those moments where, when we go back to that conversation on these fundamentals, this idea that, okay, our adversary is actively using finances to broaden the gap between our faith and our involvement in the kingdom, and getting us to try and hold these things in different hands. And what our job is not perfection. We're not expecting perfection. We're not holding you to perfection. We certainly aren't doing it ourselves. And so this conversation's not trying to figure out how do we get it right. The conversation's more so, how do we identify that drift? How do we start to identify that? And I think what we see in Joseph is exactly that. The red flag for us is Joseph does a lot of things in the first half of his life where he runs towards, here's the answer, here's the interpretation, here's the thing. And he doesn't sit back and see what God is doing. He doesn't reflect on where God has been in his life. He is at most points in the first half of his story, at the very least, feels like he's walking step in step with God as kind of co-captains to the story. I don't think Joseph would disagree that he was a faithful Israelite. I don't think Joseph would denounce God.
Yeah, something to underline, bold, italicize is, at no point do we feel like God or Joseph had denounced God. Yeah. That I think that he would say that he was a very faithful Jew. He followed God. God was his God. Like, I think that he would say all the right and good things.
Yeah.
But he did have this level of, like how you said, like a co-captain.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what we're going to see from what we look at with Joseph today on is that shifts, that changes. I think he has a moment where he's confronted very, very clearly with his past. Yeah. And in that, there's a language shift here. I mean, let's just, so we get to this point, and we're going to read some verses today, but I'm going to skip to some main things. Because again, this is a story that most of us are fairly familiar with, but Joseph's in prison. He's already interpreted the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer and kind of sent them and said, don't forget about me. And then years go on, right? He's forgotten about this mission doesn't work. And then Pharaoh has a dream, and Pharaoh's dream is uninterpretable by all of the magi's and wise men, and he's so distraught, and he's like, I wish there was someone that could interpret this dream. And then in that moment, the cupbearer goes, wait a minute, I remember this moment.
Yeah, and we're in chapter 41.
Yeah, chapter 41 of Genesis. Chapter
Jesus
41.
Is here too.
Jesus is in this, yeah. Chapter 41 of Genesis. And I think I'm just going to start in verse 9. We have that kind of cupbearer interaction. And read first through verse 24, I think. Okay. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. When Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he'd shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I'd never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they'd eaten them, no one would have known that they'd eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me." So I think the first big shift here is what happens in verse 16.
Mm-hmm.
There's this major change that Joseph that calls out to Pharaoh instantly. When we see Joseph's encountering other dreams, Joseph's kind of quick to pull the trigger on. Well, let me interpret this for you.
Yep. Yeah. And what he's done with dreams up until this point have been with relative selfish motives. Like he's had a dream, interpreted it, or he's been given a dream and interpreted it, but it's always with the end goal of like, let me spin this in a way that, like with the cupbearer, like, just remember me. And with his brothers, like, I don't know what he was trying to do with his brothers other than just kind of put them in their place and push the knife in that he was named firstborn. But I think the tone of which he receives this dream, or even before he receives this dream, I think is much more of like, I can't do this. Like,
I think Joseph's had some moments where, I mean, one of the things we have to think about as we read through any biblical story is Joseph doesn't have the end of the story written out for him.
Yeah.
He can't read through, the Genesis 37 through 50 all in one sitting and know how his life plays out. Joseph's probably gone step after step after step in his life wondering, when is my dad going to walk through the door?
Yeah.
Right? Like, you've got this, my brothers have sold me into slavery, but my dad's going to come fix this. And he doesn't. And I end up in this house, but my dad's going to come and save me. And he doesn't. And I've ended up in prison, but my dad's going to come. And like all these things and even probably more so beyond just my dad, who's probably one of the most powerful people he knows, but also, when is my God going to come in and save me?
Yeah.
And I think years into this story, at this point, that Joseph has been sitting in this prison, I think this response with Pharaoh, he has this moment of obvious reflection of, I've got this all wrong. That this isn't me doing this stuff. And it isn't about me. It isn't about my advancement. It isn't about my power. It isn't about my promise. It's none of that. That this is, I have to submit and recognize that anything God is doing, that I'm doing, God is doing in me, through me.
Yeah.
And
I think that and I'm going to link an episode to another podcast into this because it goes a lot more in depth into what we're about to talk about. And it could be a really good resource for you to just kind of dive deeper into this conversation. But what we've heard and looked at more is once Joseph was given this dream, the only one that could interpret this would be Joseph, because if he knows that the number 7 means years, the dream essentially interprets itself.
Right. Yeah. The question becomes like, okay, why could no one else interpret this dream? And how could Joseph? And the natural answer is like, well, God did it through him. And it's like, of course it is. But like, for most of us reading this dream, before Joseph interprets it, we're kind of like, well, it kind of seems a little obvious. And I think, again, that speaks to We've got the whole story here.
Right.
We know the background of Israel's storyline between Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and now Joseph. Like, we get the whole picture here, and there's layers of this that we go, well, that seemed kind of obvious. You're telling me that none of the magicians are wise men? And it's such a unique thing to think through that I think in this dream, Joseph is confronted with his own story. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's a dream that Pharaoh gets, and it's a dream that God interprets through Joseph for Pharaoh that ultimately impacts Egypt and Israel and probably the rest of the world at this point. But there's a moment in this dream that I think Joseph has to come face to face with his life story. Mm-hmm. And do you want to read the dream? Do you want to read the next,
Yeah, I can read.
Through 36 or so? Or...
Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are the 7 years, and the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now Pharaoh, look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine."
Yeah, and so like we talked about how for us, almost as the reader, Joseph's interpretation doesn't seem that mind-boggling of like, well, yeah, it seems kind of obvious that this is what this is. How could no one else figure this out? And I think one of the things that we get benefited as the reader, and where I think this is the moment in Joseph's life where he's really confronted with, where have I come from? What does this mean? What is something that's happened to Joseph's, or at least that Joseph's story is from, that sets this all? If you listen to Pharaoh's dream, and you know that the number 7 represents a timeline.
Like, where have we heard it in the past? 2 sets of 7s. Like,
well, if you know that in that, like if any of the magicians or wise men knew, okay, 7 cows, 7 corn, that's years. Those are 7 years. Like, if you knew that, then the dream basically interprets itself into this understanding of, okay, 7 good, 7 bad, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, the question becomes, I think sometimes we're quick to go, well, God did this through Joseph. And it's like, well, of course he did, but there's more to it than that. Like, why Joseph? Why was Joseph able to? And so, yeah, the question goes, this isn't the first time we as the reader, and definitely not in Joseph's story, because of how intimately tied to his story it is, that we've heard of 7 good and 7. It's even more, I think the language is more intentional to say that these were beautiful cows and these were ugly cows. This isn't the first time in Joseph's story. Now it's the very beginning of Joseph's story that we interact with the idea of 7 years and ugly, which is kind of harsh to say, when we talk about, but that's the language that Jacob, Joseph's father, uses to describe both his aunt, Leah, in those 7 years that Jacob worked and was deceived because he thought he was working for Rachel, who then is described as this beautiful person, and another set of 7 years that were worked for her. I think in this moment with this dream, Joseph's immediately confronted with, I remember Beautiful and Ugly in 7.
Yeah. And working for those years
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. I know that, like, my dad's told me that story. He went, how many times have we sat around the fire at night and he's looked at all my brothers and said, let me
And
tell you
said,
about
you're from my ugly wife.
look at this crazy grandfather that, all the, who knows? And so there's this key here. And even in the language that's written, the word used here is the same. What's the, you've got it.
So the word for sleek and fat when it comes to the cows, it's a Hebrew word that's spelled Y-A-P-E. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to try to. But it's the same word that describes Rachel's eyes. So the very first thing that Pharaoh says is, I see these 7 cows, and it's the same description as his mom.
Yeah.
And so I think that, like, and those were the first 7 years that Jacob worked for, was for that.
Yeah.
And so I think that is where, just because it's a dream that Pharaoh has, it is not necessarily for Pharaoh.
Yeah.
It's a dream for Joseph.
If this were presented in a movie sense, and I mean, I know this literally was presented in a movie, this whole story, right? I think there's this moment where you have the camera zoom in on Joseph's eye. Like, he hears the word and, like, the sound starts to fade out behind him and the camera zooms in on his eyes and you get into, like, the screen of his mind, and the scene of Joseph's life is just playing out. And I think, coupled with the years he's spent now in prison reflecting in that moment where he tells Pharaoh, it's not me, God's going to do this. In this moment, I think God is kind of giving him a wink of, like, you've figured it out.
Yeah.
And he gets this opportunity to, like, look back from the very beginning, from the moment his dad and his mom met and the 14 years of that process. That God is giving through this dream of Pharaoh, this kind of nod to Joseph of, like, look at where we've been. Look at the times in your life where you've tried to walk step in step with me, but leading the way, pushing your own agenda, moving for your own gain, and look at where that's gotten us. And I think, like, we talked about, we have this conversation a little bit about how, like, Joseph comes out of this interpretation and he looks at Pharaoh, undoubtedly the most powerful man on the planet. And he says, okay, here's what this dream means. There's going to be some really good years. Mm-hmm. Like, we're going to have bountiful, plentiful years. But following that is going to be so much desolation, so much famine, so much despair that nobody's even going to remember the good years. Like, it's going to be so bad.
There is no sugarcoating these dreams, which I find kind of crazy for some, like, to be in that position and to be someone that is telling the most powerful person on the planet at the time this news. Like, it's one thing to say, like, there's going to be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine, so do with that what you will. But he doesn't, like, he just, I mean,
Well, he doesn't even stop there.
He doesn't stop.
He doesn't say, okay, here's the interpretation.
Yeah.
He gives him next steps of, like, and here's what you should do. You should seek out an overseer and an advisors, and you should put him in this role, and you should let him do, like, he immediately comes as he understands, like, once he's lined up this idea of God's going to do this thing, and he allows this interpretation of, here's what God says.
Yeah.
Here's what you should do. And then we can follow through, I think, the story of Joseph, and we start to see, like Pharaoh hears this bad news followed with, but here's the plan of action.
Yeah.
And Pharaoh goes, well, this is great. Who should we put in charge here?
Probably the one that thought about it.
Yeah. And we see, throughout the next few chapters, and we're not going to dive too deep into this, because we really want to end on, okay, so what have we learned as we get into the next episode of, okay, well, what does that mean? How do we do some of this stuff? We see all these things where Joseph starts to put this plan into action. Pharaoh puts him in power.
Hey everyone, this is Courtney. I just wanted to pop in here real quick and just let you know that in addition to working with households on finances, we also work with churches and congregations and offer stuff like seminars on topics like generosity, aging parents, and we'll work with parents on teaching kids about generosity and stuff like that. So if you're interested and if you want to talk more or learn more about what we do, our contact information will be in the show notes and you can reach out if you like. Enjoy the rest of the podcast.
And I think one of the coolest literary representations of this that the writer uses to show Joseph's shift. We talked about the last episode of the Fundamental podcast is we have to make a shift. It's more than just understanding we're doing this wrong, or there's things, or we got to change this, or we got to implement this strategy or this plan in our finances, all that kind of stuff. All that's well and good, but if we don't make this internal shift of what of what our system's broken off of, right? Episode 6 is the system. Episode 7 is the shift. This idea that there are internal core beliefs we have both about God and money that are going to impact the things that we do. And the shift says we've got to totally change. We've sat in this space and we've got to make a change on our core belief system. That we're seeing Joseph do that in play out, and the literary technique here that we hinted at the end of the last episode that's really powerful. If you look through Jesus, there's some parallels, but if you look through Joseph's life, Joseph is given authority.
Mm-hmm. He's been named the Behor.
Yeah.
He's given the right of the firstborn.
Yeah, that was with Abraham or with Jacob, and then he shows up in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar recognizes his skill and puts him in charge of everything. He shows up in prison, and the prison captain shows all. He's given authority, and oftentimes that's represented through some garment. This second garment, this special garment that Jacob gives him. Then there are dreams, ambitions, whether they're literal dreams and it's the interpretation of, the sun and moon and stars and all that kind of stuff, or if it's the even in the language inside of this sexual tension between Potiphar's wife and her ambitions and her desires and those kinds of things. And there's this moment of interpretation, and in that interpretation we see this spiral downward that Joseph experiences, where the language specifically within his brothers and within Potiphar's house is the robe is ripped off of him. The brothers rip it off of him, go dip it in blood. Potiphar's wife rips it off of him as he flees from her presence. And he's cast into the literal pit in the story with his brothers. And then the language that the writer uses to reference that he's thrown into the prison actually refers back to the pit. There's another word that the writer could have used for the prison that he intentionally doesn't, to call you back to this parallel moment in his life, and he's thrown into the pit. And I think the coolest thing to represent this shift that Joseph is experiencing, that we're trying to tap into for ourselves, is the author inverts some of these actions in this chapter with Pharaoh. Pharaoh first, it learns about Joseph and pulls him out of the pit. Mm-hmm. And immediately gets into, okay, here's my dream. Interpret this. And after he interprets it, Pharaoh then puts the robe on him instead of ripping it off. He gives him his signet ring. And in this moment, then he imbues upon him all of this authority. Mm-hmm. He gives him, nobody except me is going to have anything over you. You are going to have as much control and power in Pharaoh. Nothing's going to happen in this land that you don't decree. And you have this visual literary this visualization of, look at the change that Joseph has experienced here compared to the rest of his life. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think another really good way that you can see this shift when it comes to his innate belief about God, like those are some of like the rippling out, like those like physical traits and relationships around him where you see like this difference. But his shift about God is, we said at the beginning of this, you kind of see him viewing himself as a co-pilot with God.
Yeah.
And in this one, I feel like he fully embodies that, like, God is in control of this.
Yeah.
God has given me the responsibility to manage this, but like God is leading this scenario.
Yeah.
I'm no longer a co-pilot. I'm a steward.
Yeah.
And you see that in chapter
In 45.
Yeah, in chapter 40.
So we're skipping ahead a bit. You've
Yes.
got the story, and we're not doing the Bible study side of this. Like,
Right.
there's just all this interaction with his brothers and stuff. You go read about that, but listen to the language he uses here.
Yeah. So in chapter 45, and there's several verses, probably like 5 through 7 is like his brothers. He's reconciled with his brothers at this point. And he just says, like, guys, like, it wasn't you that brought me here.
Yep.
Don't be distressed about that. It was because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. In verse 7, God sent me ahead of you to preserve a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of this entire household, and ruler of all of Egypt. And so you just see, and there's several other.
And this is years later.
Yeah.
We've already experienced the 7 years of good
Abundance.
and plenty, and he's done all the stewardship stuff there. And
We're in 2 years
and
here
we're a few
of
years
famine.
into the famine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're at least 9.5, 10 years into this scenario where he's had this mental shift.
Yeah.
And this sounding gong of resonance of, no, this hasn't changed. Here's the truth.
Right.
This wasn't you. It wasn't me. God was involved and in control and moving this. And so we see this first, I think, major truth. And then I think one of the coolest things is he's reconciled with his brothers here, but I don't think they really, that hasn't set in with them.
Yeah.
They don't believe it. There's so many layers of anxiety and fear and stress in their lives. And one of the things that I think is the most powerful, and then I think we'll wrap up here in a second and kind of get to here's the quick bullet chunks of what we think we were learning from Joseph. If you go to the end of the book, in Genesis 50, we have this story of Jacob and Joseph and their last few interactions before Jacob dies. And it's this beautiful kind of story finish for Jacob's story. And this desire to, don't bury me here. I want to go back to where, like, God's promise is us. But as soon as he dies, his brothers they go back into their heads and they're like, okay, well, he didn't seek out retribution for what we did to him while Dad was alive.
Yeah.
Maybe out of honor or respect or fear, whatever it was. But now that Jacob's dead, now he's going to come back and get us. And we have this same scene play out again. And in chapter 50, they've got this moment here. I'm going to start reading in verse 15 and just read a few verses because I think it really, not too many verses after this, we also get the end of Joseph's story, the end of the book of Genesis. And the end cap on Joseph's life here in comparison to where he starts and where we see him, I think is just so powerful. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. They're still deceiving. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. This recognition of they still don't get it. But Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, and I think this is, if there's ever a statement that clarifies, okay, what do we got to learn from Joseph? What do we have to figure out when it comes to how do we steward? How do we budget? Why is this the first foundational block when we look at how are we doing with our finances? How are we starting to bridge the gap between our faith and finances? And Joseph says, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. We're not gifted with Joseph's inner monologue early on in his life. But I would imagine shortly after he saw this vision of the sun and the moon and these other stars bowing down before him, and then arrogantly taking that to his family and going, guess what? This is the dream I just had. What do you think it means for you? Look how, if we got a glimpse into Joseph's inner monologue years ago in his life, I think it's likely that in his late teens, he interpreted that dream and thought, man, look at me. Mm-hmm. Look at the life that I'm about to give. Look at what am I about to have? Look at all the abundance and joy and power and and I think that's the kickoff point where you see every other decision Joseph makes up until this moment here with Pharaoh. That, yeah, he's doing some things and walking alongside and leaning into, but there's still this tinge of Joseph that he's clearly genetically inherited from his dad. Like we can see a lot of Jacob and Joseph in those moments. But he gets to this point towards the end of, at the end of Jacob's life when he's passed on, not long after that the shift in Joseph's, this is the core belief. Mm-hmm. This is, I think, the shift. That early on, the core belief was maybe even out and out. He might not have said it because it was the wrong temple answer, right? But that dream told Joseph, man, if the sun and the moon are bowing down to me, how?
The world quite literally revolves around me.
And now, this perspective shift of, I'm not God.
Yeah.
Like, this isn't, I am a steward. I am a piece in his plan. I am a role. I am operating under the guidance and reflection of him.
Yeah.
And I think as we move forward in this conversation with, okay, well, what does that mean for us?
Yeah.
I think the key parts about Joseph that we want to pick up on are his ability to be reflective. To see that moment in that interaction with Pharaoh and go, man, he recognized the crack and looked back over his life and was able to see the story of his life play out and see where God was. And so I think that's first and foremost of, in those moments where we're going through those dips, those cycles, that check and balance of trying to figure out, okay, we're not doing this well anymore. We've got to remind ourselves, where have we been? Where have we seen God play out in our lives? What is the story that he's calling us to? And then I think even in the midst of hard times or struggle or strife or bad news, Joseph was quick to go, and here's the plan that God's laid out. Mm-hmm. And here's how we're going to move forward. And then stayed with and followed through with that plan. But that, I think, ultimately, beyond his generosity, his graciousness, and all those other things that play out throughout the life of Joseph. And there's some stuff to wrestle with in Joseph's life. Yeah. Plenty of things of tension and, the navigating, all of that. And we don't mean to dismiss that. But I think ultimately the perspective shift that Joseph has, that when we move forward to talk about, okay, well, what about budgeting? What about stewardship in our lives in this essential role of bridging the gap between our faith and finances, is this massive shift that I think we all struggle with. Maybe it's played out in extreme polarizing roles in Joseph's life for us to kind of see it clearly, but this massive shift of, the first thing we got to remember is we're not God. Mm-hmm. That we have a part to play in his plan. Yeah. And a role to play in his kingdom, and that's the life that we're called to, and that there's so much wisdom in, like, it's good life, and it's for our good, and all those things.
And the posture that we sit in inside of that is not as a co-pilot, but as one that is willing to listen to the dream, and one that is like I can't do this on my own, but it's God. And so having the posture not of like, I'm the co-pilot, but one that's allowing God to speak to me and then moving on from there. Yeah.
So I think the way we continue this conversation, like we've been trying to with each of these episodes, is spend some time reflecting and asking ourselves the question, looking at the last few major expenses we've made or ways that we've sat in time budgeting and whether or not we have, are we doing that from the posture of, I'm not God, but I am the steward of God. I'm trying to reflect over my life on where God has been involved in our lives, what he's calling us to do in the kingdom. Has that been the launch pad for our financial decisions within our budget and within our spending? Or have we potentially fallen into the same cyclical trap that Joseph did, that early in his life, he was making decisions, even though he would say in step with God, very clearly trying to run out ahead of God. And can we spend some time reflecting honestly with ourselves and asking, hey, is there a part of our budget that we have not surrendered over to God? Do we really believe that we're stewards in his kingdom, or are we still trying to pick up it ourselves and do it our own way with our own reasonings?
Yeah. So that is going to wrap up this particular study about Joseph. Can't promise that he won't come back up in the future. But what it is about budgeting and money management and just that internal shift that we see Joseph have, that is something that we can practice as well. This part of the session is wrapped up. And then in the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to go into some more of the X's and O's of budgeting, some more practical stuff, things that you can take and implement in your homes and in your lives. And so we'll get into that next week and then move on from there. But we like the kind of cadence of look at it from a biblical standpoint and then look at it from a practical standpoint. So yeah. We'll see you next week. Bye, guys.